Story number 1. The room that wasn't there. When Sam and his friends rented the old Victorian house for the weekend, they thought it would be the perfect getaway. The house was massive, with creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and rooms filled with antique furniture. It was nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods. "This place is awesome," Mia said, spinning in the grand foyer. "Definitely haunted," joked Ben, running his hand over the banister of the spiral staircase. The owner had given them the keys with little fanfare, simply warning them to treat the house respectfully. "And don't go into the locked room on the 3rd floor," he added. "It's not safe." That last part, of course, piqued their curiosity. "What do you think's in there?" Sarah asked later that evening as they sat around the fireplace, wine glasses in hand. "Probably old junk," Ben said. "Or a murder scene," Mia added with a smirk. Sam laughed, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him since they arrived. The house was drafty, and the shadows seemed to stretch a little too far. Later that night, unable to sleep, Sam decided to explore. The others were already passed out in their rooms, the house silent except for the occasional groan of the old wood. The 3rd floor was darker than the rest of the house, the air colder. He found the locked door easily. It was at the end of the hallway, unremarkable except for the iron padlock. Sam stared at it, his curiosity gnawing at him. He reached out, his fingers brushing the lock when he heard it, a faint sound, like whispering, coming from the other side. He froze, his heart pounding. "Hello," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The whispering stopped. Sam turned and hurried back to his room, telling himself it was just the wind. The next morning he told the others what happened. "You're just spooked," Ben said, laughing. "This place is old, everything creaks and groans." "Maybe," Sam muttered, but he wasn't convinced. That night they heard it again. A soft, rhythmic thudding, like something heavy being dragged across the floor above them. "There's nothing up there," Mia said, clutching her blanket. Sam and Ben exchanged a glance. Without a word, they grabbed flashlights and headed upstairs, the girls following reluctantly. When they reached the 3rd floor, the noise stopped. The locked door stood at the end of the hall, the padlock gleaming in the moonlight streaming through the windows. "Let's just go back," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. But Ben wasn't listening. He had found an old iron key hanging on a hook nearby. "What if this opens it?" he said, grinning. Before anyone could stop him, he slid the key into the padlock. It clicked open. "Ben, don't," Sam said, a knot tightening in his stomach. But Ben pushed the door open. The room beyond was wrong. It was completely empty. No furniture, no windows, just 4 blank walls. The air was cold, and a strange metallic smell filled the space. "What is this?" Ben muttered, stepping inside. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. "Ben!" Mia screamed, pounding on the door. Sam and Sarah joined her, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. From inside the room came Ben's voice, muffled and frantic. "Guys, open the door! Please!" "We're trying!" Sam shouted, his hands trembling as he pulled at the door. Then Ben's voice changed. It became lower, distorted, as if 2 voices were speaking at once. "Why did you open the door?" it growled. The pounding on the door stopped as all 3 froze. "Ben," Mia whispered. The room fell silent. When they finally managed to force the door open, the room was empty. Ben was gone. They searched the entire house, the surrounding woods, even called the police, but there was no trace of him. The owner of the house was called in, but he was evasive, saying only that he had warned them not to open the door. Sam, Mia, and Sarah left that day, unable to spend another moment in the house. Years later, Sam returned to the house, unable to let go of what had happened. He convinced the new owners to let him inside. When he went to the 3rd floor, the door was gone. The hallway ended in a blank wall. And as Sam stood there, staring at the spot where the door had been, he heard it again. A faint whisper, coming from inside the wall. Story number 2. The Whispering Doll. In the small, sleepy town of Fairview, there was a shop called Antique Wonders. It was crammed with dusty trinkets, faded books, and items that seemed to carry stories from forgotten times. When Lily stumbled upon it one rainy afternoon, she was drawn in by the soft golden glow of the storefront. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but among the clutter, her eyes landed on a doll. The doll was exquisite, dressed in a lace gown that had yellowed with age. Its porcelain face was perfectly painted with bright blue eyes and lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. There was something captivating about it, something almost alive. "How much for the doll?" Lily asked the shopkeeper, an old man with a hunched back and clouded eyes. "Are you sure you want her?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Lily laughed nervously. "It's just a doll." The man hesitated before naming a price, and minutes later, Lily left the shop with the doll tucked under her arm. The doll, which Lily named Annette, took pride of place on her bedroom shelf. But from the moment it arrived, strange things began to happen. At night, Lily often felt like she was being watched. She'd wake up to find Annette slightly out of place, tilted to the side or facing a different direction. "It's just the house settling," she told herself when she heard faint creaks in the night. But deep down, unease began to grow. One evening, as Lily brushed her hair in front of the mirror, she swore she saw the doll's reflection move. She froze, her brush mid-stroke, staring at Annette in the mirror. The doll sat perfectly still on the shelf, her painted smile as serene as ever. Lily shook her head. "I'm imagining things." But that night, she woke to a sound. A faint whispering voice. Her heart thudded as she strained to hear. The whispering was soft but unmistakable, like someone murmuring secrets just out of reach. It was coming from the shelf. Trembling, she turned on the bedside lamp. Annette sat in her usual spot, her blue eyes glinting in the dim light. "Stop freaking yourself out," Lily muttered, pulling the covers over her head. But the whispers continued. The next day, Lily tried to get rid of the doll. She stuffed it in a box and shoved it in the attic, slamming the door shut. But that night the whispers returned, louder this time, insistent. When she turned on the light, Annette was back on the shelf. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She knew she hadn't put the doll there. "Who's doing this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of her own breathing. And then the doll's head turned. It was slow, deliberate, and unnatural, the porcelain neck creaking softly as it swiveled to face her. Lily screamed and fled the room, slamming the door behind her. She spent the night on the couch, unable to sleep. The next morning, she returned to the antique shop. Annette clutched tightly in her hands. "I need to return this," she said, slamming the doll onto the counter. The old man looked at her with tired eyes. "I told you she wasn't for sale." "What is this thing?" Lily demanded. He sighed. "She's been with me for years. Always comes back no matter how far she's taken. She's attached." "Take it back," Lily insisted. The man shook his head. "It's too late. She's chosen you now." Lily left the shop in a panic, the doll still in her possession. That night the whispers turned into laughter, soft, chilling giggles that echoed through the house. And when Lily awoke, Annette was sitting on her chest, her blue eyes staring into hers. The doll's porcelain lips parted, and in a voice that was both childlike and hollow, she whispered, "Don't you love me?" Story number 3. The door at the end of the hall. When Evan moved into the old boarding house, he didn't think much of the strange architecture. The hallways were narrow, the ceilings too high, and every floor seemed to have at least one room that was always locked. The landlady, a stern woman named Mrs. Horner, was quick to brush off any questions. "Some rooms are just storage," she'd say curtly. Evan's room was at the far end of the third-floor hallway. It was cozy enough, with a small bed, a desk, and a single window that overlooked the overgrown garden. The only thing that unnerved him was the door directly across from his room. Unlike the others, this door was different. It was older, its wood dark and cracked, with a brass knob that looked polished despite its age. No matter the time of day, a cold draft seemed to seep from the edges, and Evans swore he could hear faint sounds behind it. Soft scratching, like something trying to get out. One evening, curiosity got the better of him. He stood in front of the door, ear pressed against the wood. Nothing. But as he turned to walk away, he heard it, a faint knock from the other side. He froze, heart racing. "Hello?" he called softly. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Evan's hand trembled as he reached for the knob. It was ice cold to the touch. He twisted it, but the door wouldn't budge. "Is someone in there?" he asked. Silence. The next morning he asked Mrs. Horner about the door. "That room is sealed for a reason," she said sharply. "Don't mess with it." Her tone was final, but her eyes betrayed something. Fear. That night the knocking returned, more insistent. Evan tried to ignore it, burying his head under his pillow. But then he heard something else. A voice. "Let me out," it whispered. Evan bolted upright, his room now freezing. The door across the hall seemed to pulse, the faint scratching noise growing louder. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Please," the voice begged. It was faint, childlike. "I'm trapped." Evan couldn't stand it any longer. He grabbed his key and tried it in the old lock. To his surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty room. The air was damp and heavy, and the smell of decay made him gag. "Hello," he called, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind him. The room was impossibly large, far bigger than the space should allow. Shadows danced along the walls, and the faint sound of breathing filled the air. "Let me out," the voice came again, this time behind him. Evan turned, but no one was there. The breathing grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and circling him. "Who are you?" he shouted, backing against the wall. A figure emerged from the darkness, a child no older than 10 with sunken eyes and pale skin stretched tightly over its face. Its mouth curled into a chilling smile. "Thank you," it whispered. Before Evan could react, the child lunged at him, its form dissolving into a cold, black mist that wrapped around him, pulling him into the shadows. When Mrs. Horner checked the room the next morning, she found the door firmly locked, as it always was. There was no sign of Evan. Later that day, a new tenant moved into the boarding house, taking Evan's old room. And across the hall, the door waited. Story number 4, The Reflection. When Jenna moved into the old apartment downtown, she was thrilled to find it came with a massive antique mirror mounted in the living room. Its frame was ornate, carved with intricate floral designs, and the glass itself had a faint, smoky tint that made it look as though it had secrets to tell. The landlord mentioned it had been there for decades, too heavy to move. "Part of the charm," he had said with a shrug. At first, Jenna loved the mirror. It added character to the otherwise plain room, and she found herself admiring her reflection often. But after a few weeks, she started noticing oddities. It began subtly. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. A faint shadow that didn't match anything in the room. She dismissed it as her imagination, but the unease lingered. One night, as she sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, she glanced up at the mirror and froze. Her reflection wasn't moving. Jenna stared, her chest tightening. Her body was still, her phone in her lap. But in the mirror, her reflection was slightly turned, as if it had been caught looking at something over its shoulder. Blinking rapidly, Jenna looked down at her phone and back up. Her reflection now matched her movements perfectly. "I'm overtired," she whispered to herself, turning off the lights and going to bed. But the incidents grew worse. Sometimes she'd catch her reflection smiling when her own face wasn't. Other times it seemed slower to follow her movements, as if it were thinking about them first. One night, Jenna decided to test it. She stood in front of the mirror and waved her hand. Her reflection waved back, but there was a hesitation, a half-second lag that made her stomach drop. "Hello?" she whispered, feeling foolish. Her reflection tilted its head, a gesture Jenna hadn't made. Heart pounding, she backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. She threw a sheet over the mirror, determined not to look at it again. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the living room. Jenna sat up, her throat dry. The tapping grew louder, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails on glass. Summoning her courage, she crept into the living room. The sheet had fallen to the floor and the mirror was uncovered. Her reflection wasn't there. The glass was empty, showing only the room behind her. She froze, staring at the blank surface, when something moved behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, her reflection had returned, but it was closer now, its face pressed against the glass, grinning.